Howdy, fellow travelers. It's another glorious day on the path, and thank you for once again tuning in to Mac's Podcast. I'm excited to get back into it, so let's just go ahead and dive right in. Today, we're going to be talking about mass extinctions. Are we on the precipice of one? Is this going to be cataclysmic for the environment and for the human species? Will we be able to survive? These are some of the questions that I'm going to attempt to answer in this podcast, so let's go ahead and dive right into it.
Mac.
An exotic, sophisticated Superman of sorts.
Because of you, the security of this entire universe is in jeopardy.
You can destroy the entire social structure.
What? What are you talking about?
People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
You people look like nice people. I don't know whether you're nice at all, but you could be concerned about the extinction of various species of animals. I don't give a hoot. And it's a practical matter. I mean, because according to biologists, something like 93% of everything that has ever lived on Earth is now extinct. And I say, why getting a tizzy over 93.2, 0.5, or whatever, you know?
All right, so obviously I'm being a bit facetious with those two clips juxtaposing each other, and I think it highlights the two extreme examples of people's thoughts about extinction. You have people like Greta Thunberg on the left, which in that very famous speech now, she talked about how ecosystems are collapsing and that we're on the brink of a mass extinction. On the other hand, you have people like the late Walter Williams, one of my favorite economists, and in his lecture, he made this sort of small tangent and talked about the extinction of various animals. And I think that it goes to show that there are these two extremes where, like, on one side, you have people who feel like the world is going to end if we don't do something. And on the other hand, people are like, I don't really care. I kind of fall somewhere in the middle of that. And I think that through this podcast and through some of the data that I'm going to share with you guys, we're going to see why I've come to the conclusions that I've come to. And hopefully you guys can learn a little bit something. I learned a little bit something doing this research, and I think that we can pull together a little bit and have a better, more nuanced take on this entire subject. All right, so the first thing that I think that we should really nail down for this discussion is what exactly a mass extinction event is. I'm sure you've heard the term. Maybe you heard that speech by Greta Thunberg. Maybe you've heard other people on the news or wherever, various sources, talk about us being on the brink of another mass extinction. So what is a mass extinction? And I'm going to turn now to a website called ourworldindata.org. This is the first of two articles that I have pulled up from this website. And here it says, first, we need to be clear on what we mean by mass extinction. Extinctions are a normal part of evolution. They occur naturally and periodically over time. There's a natural background rate to the timing and frequency of extinctions. 10% of species are lost every million years, 30% of species every 10 million years, and 65% of species every 100 million years. It would be wrong to assume that species going extinct is out of line with what we would expect. Evolution occurs through the balance of extinction, the end of species, and speciation, the creation of species. Extinctions occur periodically at what we would call the background rate. We can therefore identify periods of history when extinctions were happening much faster than this background rate. This would tell us that there was an additional environmental or ecological pressure creating more extinctions than we would expect. But mass extinctions are defined as periods with much higher extinction rates than normal. They are defined by both magnitude and rate. Magnitude is the percentage of species that are lost. Rate is how quickly this happens. These metrics are inevitably linked, but we need both to qualify as a mass extinction. In a mass extinction, at least 75% of species go extinct within a relatively short period of time by geological standards, which is typically less than 2 million years. So 75% of species in 2 million years. Now, the interesting thing is that this is one of the only websites that I found in my research that would actually give concrete numbers to defining what a mass extinction is. On dictionary.com, it just basically says that it's an extinction of a large number of species within a short period of time, relatively speaking. And it doesn't really give any sort of like, it has to be this many, this fast. Now, obviously, this is like a loose definition, but I think that it's a good one to work with, because otherwise it's really difficult to have an understanding of, if we are in a mass extinction at the beginning of one, how would we be able to tell? We only know about the mass extinctions in the history because of our scientific data and being able to go back and look at the fossil records. But obviously, we're not going to have fossil records. How will we tell if we right now are at the beginning of a mass extinction, and if we can do something to go off of that course so that we can avoid this event? Now, in this same article, I want to just highlight the big 5 mass extinctions that have happened in history. All right, so as you can see in this chart, you have 5 extremely high peaks on this relatively stable graph. And these peaks denote each of the mass extinction events that have happened in the past. The very first one was about 450 million years ago or so, and that's the Ordovician. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. The second one is about 360 million years ago. That's the late Devonian. Then you have 250 million years ago, the end of the Permian. And then number 4, 200 million years ago, the Triassic. And number 5, this is the one that everybody's heard about, 65 million years ago, the end of the Cretaceous period. And this is the mass extinction that pretty much killed off the dinosaurs. Now, I think it'll be interesting to look at some of the causes of these mass extinctions. And if you look here at this other chart that I have, you can see that each one has its time frame, as well as the percentage of species lost at the time and the cause of the extinctions. Now, the one that's the highest, which was the end Permian extinction event, 250 million years ago, 96% of all species on Earth went extinct during this event. Now, it says here, intense volcanic activity in Siberia caused global warming, elevated CO2 and sulfur levels from volcanoes caused ocean acidification, acid rain, and other changes in ocean and land chemistry. Now, the majority of the species that died in this extinction event were marine life. So this is species that live in the water. It was hard to find whether or not, like a breakdown of how many of the species in the water died as compared to the ones on the land. Some of the numbers that I saw were somewhere around 90% of the species, or 90% of the 96 were water species, and the remaining 6% were land species. So this really had a devastating effect on our oceans, and it just almost completely wiped out life on Earth. Now, the end of the Cretaceous period, that was, again, 65 million years ago, about 76% of species died in that event, and so that brings it just barely over the cap for the term mass extinction event as defined by ourworldindata.org. All right, so now that we have a general idea of what a mass extinction event might be, let's go ahead and talk about where we're at today. So how many species have gone extinct in the last 100 years? That was the first question that I thought to myself. I was like, okay, well, if we're in a mass extinction event, let's find out. Let's do some math. We could probably calculate this. And the result that I got was pretty interesting. Here I'm on Reader's Digest. Now, this isn't like a extremely scientific website, but just, it's basically stating that since 1900, about 500 species of animals have gone extinct, according to a 2015 study. I looked for the study, had a hard time finding it, so we're just going to go with Reader's Digest. But basically, in the last 100 years or so, we've lost about 500 species. Now, what's interesting is here I have an article pulled up from Reuters.com, and in this article, it says that scientists count 881 animal species as having gone extinct since around 1500. So in the last 100 years, it was about 500 species. In the last 500 years, it's about 900 species. So you can tell that the extinction of species is increasing over time, because in the last 100 years, we had 500 species go extinct. And in the last 400 years before that, we had about 300 species go extinct, 300 to 400. So that's an increase. I didn't calculate the percentage of the increase, but it's significant, and it's worth noting that it is increasing over time. All right, so now going to the second article that I have pulled up from ourworldindata.org, let's talk about how many species there are on the planet. So that's going to help us calculate this number and figure out if we are on the path to a mass extinction as defined by Our World in Data. So it seems like a pretty interesting question, and one that you would think that we might have a solid answer to, but in fact we don't. We actually don't really have a conclusive answer as to how many species there really are on the Earth. One of the things that we can see here is that there's a difference between how many species there are and how many species we have described. And the term described just means, in scientific terms, species that have been identified and described in scientific journalings. So, we have to have some sort of an idea about the species, and we have to know that it's an actual distinct species and not just a very common cousin, if you will, or something like that with another species. So this happens a lot. There will be species that are named, but they're actually just synonym species. And so they're technically the same species with slight variations, but not enough variations to denote it as an entirely different species. The breakdown you can see right here in this graph: number of described species in all groups, which includes insects, mollusks, arachnids, crustaceans, fish, reptile, birds, amphibians, mammals, and corals. There's about 2.16 million species. Insects make up the overwhelming majority of this, over half at 1.05 million. Then you come all the way down to, surprisingly, there's less species of coral than there are mammals. That was very interesting to me. I did not know that. I also did not know that there were so many species of coral, but that's just one interesting thing that you learn when you do a little bit of research. So, how many species are there actually out there, though? So that's the 2.16 million is the number that we've described. We have detailed descriptions about those species. What about the actual number of all the species? So I want to use this quote here by Robert May. If some alien version of the Starship Enterprise visited Earth, what might the visitor's first question be? I think it would be, how many distinct forms of life does your planet have? Embarrassingly, our best guess would be in the range of 5 to 10 million eukaryotes, which are multicellular organisms. Never mind, that's leaving out viruses and bacteria, anything that's single-celled. But we could defend numbers exceeding 100 million or as low as 3 million. So that's a pretty wide range. You could have anywhere between 2.5, 3 million species to well over 100 million species. We really just don't know. Places like the Amazon rainforest, extremely remote parts of our planet that are really hard for human beings to get to and for science to be conducted, these could be harboring millions and millions of species that we just have no idea about. Now, it does say here, one of the most widely cited figures from Camilo Mora and her colleagues, they estimate that there are around 8.7 million species on Earth. That's the most widely accepted guesstimate, if you will. About 8 million. 8.5, maybe 9 if you want to round it up. About 8 to 9 million species. So we're going to use that number for our calculation to find out, hey, are we in a mass extinction event? Let's find out. All right, so another thing that I want to just keep in mind also is that before a species becomes extinct, they're usually classified as endangered. You may have heard of the Endangered Species Act, which is a federal act here in America where the government will start to defend and try to protect these species with different regulations and it opens up a lot more funding for studies and different conservation organizations to try to protect and maintain these endangered species without letting them go extinct. So that way we can preserve them for the future. So here I'm on the Smithsonian's Museum of Natural History website. And here they talk about the extinction rates and how many species we know of are currently endangered. And it says here, recent studies estimate about 8 million species on Earth, of which at least 15,000 are threatened with extinction. So 15,000 species are endangered and are threatened with extinction right now. Let's go ahead and start doing some of this math. So like we said, we're going to go with a rounded, widely accepted number of about 8 million species of eukaryotes, which is, again, multicellular organisms. This doesn't include viruses and bacteria and things like that. But of multicellular organisms, there's about 8 million on the planet. Now, for context, if we were using this 8 million number to calculate whether or not we're entering into a mass extinction based on let's just use the amount of species that have gone extinct in the last 100 years, which is about 500. So, and again, for you mathematicians, I'm sure if there are any out there, y'all are freaking out because I'm generalizing a lot of these numbers, but I'm not a mathematician, so this is just making it easier for me to do the math. But basically, if we go with that number of 500 species in the last 100 years have gone extinct, that means that 0.001875% of species on Earth have gone extinct since 1900. Now, again, this doesn't include all of the species that we don't know about, obviously, so we're playing with a very gray area here. But again, so that's a very small percentage, less than 1%. But if you were to extrapolate that percentage out to 1 million years, that's about 18.75% of species that would be extinct in 1 million years. So that's almost 20%. Almost 20%. And if we remember exactly what the calculation was from Our World in Data, so again, according to Our World in Data, a mass extinction event is where at least 75% of species go extinct within 2 million years. So in 1 million years, assuming everything stays exactly the same, perpetuating into the future, in 1 million years, we will have lost about 20%. And that's also rounding up. So it's not quite to that level yet. In 2 million years, that would be about 40%. That's still less than half and still very far away from the 75% that is defined by Our World in Data. Now, I'm sure ourworldindata.org aren't the be-all, end-all deciders of what a mass extinction event is. But again, I just wanted to use these numbers to provide some context to this whole scenario. So extinctions naturally happen. It's not as if you can ever get to the point where extinctions won't happen, but it is important to notice if we are accelerating extinctions. But if we look again at the cause of these mass extinction events, we're talking about intense glacial and interglacial periods created large swings in sea levels and moved shorelines dramatically. Tectonic uplift of the Appalachian Mountains created lots of weathering, sequestration of CO2, and with it changes in the climate and ocean chemistry. So this is an interesting thing. The first mass extinction event was caused by rising sea levels, shorelines shifting dramatically, and the tectonic plates creating the Appalachian Mountains changed a lot of the weather, and that pulled a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere. It sequestered CO2. That's a big phrase that you hear nowadays in climate talks. You want to sequester CO2. You want to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. Well, pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere was one of the main causes of the very first mass extinction event. So that's just like an ironic happenstance, I guess, if you will. In the late Devonian mass extinction event, rapid growth and diversification of land plants generated rapid and severe global cooling. So again, I think this has to do with a sequestration of CO2 out of the air because of all of this diversification. So there was literally speciation happening so fast that a mass extinction event happened to correct this explosion of life that was starting to come about 360 million years ago. And again, this extinction event was due to global cooling. Because, I mean, you have to imagine that these are probably pretty hot periods in the Earth's history. That's usually when you see a lot of speciation happening, is during warmer times. And so if you cool the atmosphere dramatically during these warmer times, obviously there's going to be a ton of species, plants and animals, that aren't adapted to those cooler temperatures, and they'll die off. The next one was the one that we looked at before, which was the intense volcanic activity, which elevated CO2 and caused acidification and acid rain in the ocean. And then the Triassic extinction event, underwater volcanic activity, caused global warming and a dramatic change in the chemistry and composition in the oceans. I think you guys are starting to see a pattern. When you fuck with the oceans, it really messes up the extinction rate. And then, of course, the dinosaur extinction, which is posited to be an asteroid impact in Yucatan, Mexico, which created a global cataclysm and rapid cooling. Some changes may have already predated this asteroid with intense volcanic activity and tectonic uplift shifting. So maybe there was some hard times happening due to intense volcanic activity, and then a giant meteorite 6 miles long slams into the earth, and that just basically is the death nail in the coffin, as they say. So when you're looking at these causes for these mass extinction events in the past, I want to try to juxtapose what's happening now with that. And it's kind of hard because these are massive, world-altering events that are happening relatively quickly, but it's hard to say whether or not we're also having that same kind of an impact. They're talking about multiple, like 2 or 3 degrees Celsius of warming, creating all of the problems with climate change and global warming. A lot of the climate scientists don't specifically show the linkage between climate change and the rate of extinctions. But obviously, as the climate changes, species either adapt or they die. And so if the climate changes extremely fast, lots of species are not going to be able to adapt. But if the climate changes slowly, then it would give more species time to adapt and continue on and not go extinct. Now, I do want to return to one of the points that Walter Williams made earlier in the first clip that I played. And he was talking about how scientists at that time were estimating that about 93% of all the species that were ever alive on the planet were extinct. Come to find out, after doing research, that's actually been bumped up to 99%. So 99% of all the species that have ever existed on planet Earth are assumed to be extinct. And so everything that we have now, let's say the 8 million eukaryotes, that's 1% of all the species that have ever lived on the planet. And so I think it just goes to show that even if extremely important species to various ecosystems go extinct, that doesn't necessarily mean that life is going to somehow not be able to bounce back from that. I mean, obviously, as we saw, 96% of species died in one of the big 5 mass extinctions in the past. And if it were the case that if you lose some very vital species in an ecosystem, you would think that all life would just completely die out. But it didn't, because the process of evolution and the natural process and the resiliency of life on this planet is extremely high, and it is extremely robust. And so it always seems to bounce back. That's not saying that it always will, but given in our history, it seems to do that. An interesting point that I think not a lot of people really give a lot of credit to is the fact that if it weren't for the mass extinction that happened at the end of the Cretaceous period, which killed off the dinosaurs, Homo sapiens, human beings, you and I watching this, they really probably wouldn't exist. It's hard to say, but mammals became the dominant life forms on the planet after the massive asteroid impacted and killed off the dinosaurs, and we are mammals. So it's hard to theorize or speculate whether or not Homo sapiens would have evolved without that removal process of these other species that were taking up those vital resources that mammals would have needed to continue to thrive. So I think it's an important analogy to remember that an ecosystem is a lot like an economy, and you need failure and competition in an economy just as much as you do in an ecosystem. If you have an economy where a business can continue to lose money but never go out of business, that's obviously going to drain resources from people who would use those dollars in a more efficient way. Whereas in an ecological standpoint, if you have an ecosystem where species are not allowed to die off to make room for new ones, then you kind of get stuck in this limbo period, and there's not really a lot of advancing that can happen. And frankly, that's never happened before. So we're not entirely sure how that's going to impact things going forward. If we just continue to maintain dozens and dozens and maybe possibly all of the species that are currently alive right now, we don't really know what kind of an impact that's going to have on the natural process, because as we read earlier, it is important to have speciation, the creation of species, but also extinction, because if you don't have extinction, then there's not enough room for these new species to develop. And speaking about economics, I think that it's important to highlight that there are a handful of species that are not in danger of going extinct. And I mean, not just like right now, obviously the majority of species aren't in danger of going extinct, but you can tell that there's some that really thrive around human activity. I'm talking about pigeons. I'm talking about raccoons, coyotes, cows, chickens, various fish species. And if you ask yourself, well, why are these species so well adapted to being around humans? Well, some of them have particular qualities that make them better to living around urban environments or just human activity in general. These would be like the pigeons, the raccoons, the coyotes. These types of animals, for whatever reason, they thrive in that sort of suburban or even urban environment created by human beings. And then you have things like cows, chicken, fish. These things aren't necessarily super well adapted, but they've been domesticated and they now have intrinsic value in them because somebody owns them. If you spend $5,000 on a cow, you want to make sure that that cow stays alive. And that's kind of the idea. You can broaden that idea out to all of humanity and all of cows. I don't know what the right word for that would be, but basically humans want to make sure that cows stay around and don't go extinct because we have a lot invested in them. We rely on them quite a bit, if I'm being honest. I mean, the majority of my diet is cows. I drink a lot of milk and I eat a lot of beef. So if cows were to go extinct, I would be fucked. Now, one really interesting thing that I learned about when I was doing my research, but I had also kind of heard about it in various podcasts in the past, was that there's a lot of, maybe not a lot, but there's a handful of organizations that are doing work to bring back extinct species, to basically reanimate them, if you will. Sort of like the reanimation jutsu from Naruto, if you're a weeb. And one of the things that I think is slightly being overlooked about this is that we don't really know how bringing these species back is going to impact our environment today. Now, these species, most of them went extinct because the environment around them changed and they couldn't adapt to it. And if you bring them back into that same environment, not really, it's continuing to evolve past them. If you bring them back into that environment, we don't know what might happen. I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is that they'll just die off again because they're still not adapted to it. The second thing that I'm thinking about is certain various changes could have happened while they were gone that they could actually be extremely well adapted now. And that could have extremely negative impacts on species that are alive currently. So you're kind of playing with fire. You're sort of like damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you leave them extinct, then obviously they're extinct and you don't get to experience them anymore. But if you bring them back, you're kind of rolling the dice on what the second, third, and fourth tier consequences of that are going to be, because you don't really know what it's going to be like to have mammoths running around again. We have elephants, and so you can have sort of like a guesstimation of what that might be. But elephants, modern day elephants and mammoths lived in completely different climates. Like an elephant lives in like African safari. It's extremely hot. It's very dry. Woolly mammoths were woolly. They had a lot of fur. They had a lot of extra fat because they lived in very cold climates. It just stands that you don't really know exactly what's going to happen. And so I think that it's really, personally, if you want to use your own money to do that, by all means, go for it. But a lot of these organizations are funded by governments, and governments have to get money from their people. And I think that personally for me, like, I don't really want my tax dollars going to fund some sort of a project to bring a bunch of these extinct species back, because I think we'd be much better off if we were setting up an environment so that human beings can thrive and the species that we require for life can thrive. And speciation is going to continue to happen. And so we can leave the door open for a lot of these new species that aren't around right now. And in that vein, I want to pull up a short clip from the Joe Rogan podcast with a gentleman named Forrest Galante. not exactly sure what this gentleman does. Sort of like he talks a lot of wide-ranging topics with Joe Rogan, so it's hard to really nail down exactly what he does, but they kind of talk about this idea of conservation, which is really big in the outdoor space. As you guys may know, I'm studying and learning how to hunt, and I already know how to fish, and so these things, the conservation mindset is extremely high because people want to conserve white-tailed deer, they want to conserve the largemouth bass and keep them around because there are millions and millions of people that really enjoy engaging with these animals, hunting them, fishing them, eating them. And so the conservation world is a big part of this extinction conversation, but I think that there are some flaws in the mainstream thinking and how a lot of mainstream conservationists approach this topic.
Isn't it crazy how different people look at things like wildlife conservation today versus just a few hundred years ago? It's like, whoops, guess we killed all the bison.
Yeah, totally. But that's why radical conservation, like the bringing back mammoths and rewilding wolves and stuff like that, we need that, Joe.
Yeah.
Because conservation, I'm sorry, and this is going to upset a lot of people. I don't give a shit. We fucking suck at it. We've been doing it for 100 years, and we are losing every single year. We are not winning. There are small little successful stories, don't get me wrong.
Right.
But on a grand scale, we are losing the conservation game. So radical conservation, I don't care what it is, coming up with crazy science experiments and bringing stuff back, putting wolves in Yellowstone, whatever it is, trying something is better than not trying anything and continuing down the path we've been going.
So as you can see, Mr. Galante there, he has a very pessimistic view about our track record with conservation. The part about this that is really interesting is that I hear a lot of conservationists have this same sort of pessimistic doom and gloom outlook on their successes. And it makes me think well, what would be success to you? If we could ensure that not a single species ever going forward from now would go extinct, would that be success? But then also you hear people that really they use the term rewilding in that clip. There's a lot of people in the conservation sphere that would like to return us to the late 1800s or something like that. And it's okay, well, first of all, you're picking an arbitrary date because why don't we conserve, why don't we try to go back and be conservationists for the 1300s or for the 900s? Or for any of the time before we changed the calendar, ancient times. I mean, what exactly is awesome about the particular time period that you picked as opposed to any other time period in history or any potential outlooks that we could have in the future? And so this idea of conservation is I think great on the one hand, but I think like many things, we can take it too far and we can start getting to the point where if even one species goes extinct, then we failed. Well, I think that that's pretty hubristic of us to think if we're trying to say that we can control the natural process of evolution and extinction and speciation. I mean, these are extremely powerful forces that dictate vast amounts of what happened on this planet and possibly all planets all over the place in the universe. And so to think that these little Homo sapiens, which are just another species in the cog, we somehow think that we have enough intelligence or foresight to do what is quote unquote correct and conserve things the way they should be. And I think that that's an interesting thing. So I think overall, my main point is that it's not that I don't care if species go extinct, and I think that we should certainly try to keep species from going extinct if we can. But I think we also have to accept that, unfortunately, some species are going to go extinct, and there's really not too much that we can do about that because, there's scarce resources. And so we can't put all of our funding into saving some random species of bug somewhere, especially if they don't have an extremely important role in the ecosystem that they happen to inhabit. So at the end of the day, I think that we should definitely try to keep species around, but we should also be open to the idea that there's going to be new species that get discovered and new species that get created. Maybe there's new species getting created every single day. I mean, we really just don't know. So I think maybe what would be a better use of funding would be to actually go out and try to learn about all the species that there are on the planet. And then once you have a better idea of what you're really working with, then we can start thinking okay, this is what we got going on right now. And once you have that, once you actually know where you're standing, if you have a map, you have a much better chance of choosing a good direction to go in that isn't extremely inefficient with costs and with all of these resources that are, again, like I said in the first episode of this podcast where we talked about water, all the resources that we use are extremely scarce, and we can't just throw them away willy-nilly on saving every little bee or every little whatever. Bees aren't really a good example because everybody loves bees and their pollinations, but people don't really know. Like, this is an interesting point. This is sort of a tangent off my notes, but honeybees are actually not native to North America. They're brought over from, I can't remember if it's a hybridized version of African bees or if it's a European bee maybe, but honeybees, like the quintessential pollinator, is not even native to North America. It's an invasive species. So here in America, we had, I mean, people don't know, but like bats are one of the biggest pollinators, or where they were before bees. Other types of hummingbirds, other types, basically anything that drinks nectar or rummages around in flowers is a pollinator. And so then you have things like corn. Corn is a self-pollinator, so it grows up really tall and then it sprouts the pollen, and then the wind just blows the pollen over to some other plant. So there's lots of different ways that the natural process has figured out to solve a lot of these issues. And so I think that it's a little bit childish to be like, oh my God, we broke this tiny little thing. It's like, yeah, well, we got 18 other ones over there, like let's not cry over spilled milk, as they say. So that was the discussion about extinction. I think that for me personally, it was extremely enlightening to learn about the numbers about extinction and what actually classifies a mass extinction event. It was also really fascinating. I knew that there were mass extinction events in the past, didn't really know how many, and I didn't know the causes of these mass extinction events. And so to see those and juxtapose them with what's happening today, it was really enlightening. And I hope you guys learned something. I would really love to know what you guys think about this topic. Leave it in the comments, shoot me a question if you have them, or just tell me what you think, and we can get a really good discussion going down there. I'm always happy to converse with you guys, because I think that that's exactly what this is supposed to be about. We're supposed to be having these conversations, not to try to put down other people or show how people are wrong, but just to try to learn together and teach each other things that we don't know. And I think through that, we can all become a lot more educated and then eventually make better decisions about all of these topics that we'll discuss going forward. Thanks again for watching the podcast, and I'll see you next time.